It cannot be emphasised how pivotal the first scene of a movie is. If the prologue doesn't draw you in from the get-go, don't expect the film to keep your attention for the next 2 hours or longer. But if the filmmakers craft an incredible opening act, they're sure to have the viewer's undivided attention until the credits roll. Creating the prelude of a horror can be a bit trickier, since the genre can't help relying on the same tired tropes. However, there are some horror flicks that begin with such an intriguing mystery, compelling performance, or heartbreaking revelation we are immediately invested, knowing we are in for one hell of a ride. I'm Tilly from What Culture Horror, and these are movies you knew would be good after the first 10 minutes. The Host. There are countless movie monsters that were created after encountering a man-made contaminant. The creatures from Chud, Godzilla, Them, and technically the Ninja Turtles all came to be after being exposed to pollution. So when The Host begins with a scene of a scientist dumping chemicals down a sink, it's clear this action will lead to the creation of the film's monstrous villain. Even though we have seen this scene play out many a time, the Host's prologue hits a lot harder, due to the sheer volume of waste that the scientist disposes of. He doesn't just empty a couple of bottles, instead, he dumps a whopping 200 containers of formaldehyde. For the record, 2 tablespoons of this compound will kill a human being. As the camera slowly pans across the room, revealing the staggering amount of poison that's about to be poured straight into the Hans River, your mind goes wild, trying to comprehend what sort of behemoth these chemicals will create. The Descent. The Descent centres around a group of spelunkers who decide to explore a cave, only to learn it's inhabited by carnivorous humanoids called crawlers. Because of the premise, it's natural for the viewer to assume the scares in The Descent won't start until the characters enter the cave. So, when the movie begins with our lead Sarah in the car with her husband and daughter, we totally let our guard down. With no warning, the car crashes into another vehicle that happens to be transporting steel poles. The collision causes the poles to fly into Sarah's car, impaling her husband and daughter, killing them both instantly. What makes this scene so shocking is the fact there's no build-up whatsoever. Before we have a chance to process what's going on or who these characters are, 2/3 of everyone on screen is killed off. Although some viewers may have been daydreaming up until this scene, it goes without saying that everyone was paying attention after this moment. As genuinely unsettling as the crawlers are, a lot of viewers were freaked out more by this opening. Cube. In Cube, a man called Alderson awakens inside a bizarre cube-shaped room. Each wall is adorned with a hatch-activated door, as is the floor and ceiling. Upon opening any of these doors, Alderson sees it join onto an identical-looking room. But after he takes one step into the next room, Alderson stops dead, figuratively and literally, as we hear an alarming whooshing sound sweep around him. After a few seconds, a grid-shaped pattern shaded in red forms across Alderson's clothes. Before the viewer has a chance to comprehend what just happened, blood begins oozing from lined streaks across Alderson's face, while chunks of his limbs start breaking off. Suddenly, Alderson's body splits into 2, causing his whole body to crumble into cube-shaped blocks. The camera then holds on the culprit, a razor-sharp grating, before cutting to the film's title. We know absolutely nothing about this character, nor is he mentioned again. He never interacts with the ensemble, nor does he speak, and yet we are so curious about what we just saw, it's impossible not to get completely invested in the story. Midsommar. Because of Midsommar's 148-minute runtime, it was imperative for Ari Aster to open with a mega shocker to grab your attention. Fortunately, Aster went beyond the call of duty by crafting a gut-wrenching prologue that's sure to stay with you long after the credits roll. In the first scene, Dani rings her neglectful boyfriend Christian after she receives disturbing messages from her mentally ill sister. Because Christian is having a drink with his mates, he dismisses Dani's calls. But when he finally answers, he hears Dani howling hysterically. Now, what we hear is not an ordinary scream. What we hear is a haunting wail coming from the depths of Dani's soul. Because of her inhuman screeching, we know Dani has suffered an unbearable tragedy. But nobody is ready for what comes next. We then cut to Dani's family home, where we see her sibling lying beside her computer table, with a hosepipe jammed down her throat. As haunting as this visual is, it gets so much worse. As the camera zooms onto the computer screen, we see she sent a message to Dani, which reads, "Mum and Dad are coming too. Goodbye." At this point, we understand she's filled the house with carbon monoxide, resulting in the death of herself and her parents. In that moment, you feel your heart break, knowing Dani has lost her entire family in just one evening. Although overly shocking prologues can be gimmicky, Midsommar's opening feels necessary, as it warns the viewer they are in for a very, very uneasy watch. The Ritual. Although most horror films open with an exceptionally frightening scene, The Ritual begins with 5 lads in a pub, which can be pretty goddamn terrifying. But as 2 of the friends, Rob and Luke, head to the store to grab some booze, they notice the cash register lying on the ground, bloodied and beaten. As a group of robbers burst in from the back, Luke hides while Rob stays in the open. When the thieves spot Rob, they order him to give them his belongings. After Rob notices Luke has armed himself with a bottle, he assumes his friend is going to save him. But Luke chickens out, giving the robbers the opportunity to bludgeon Rob to death. Because it's tempting for a horror movie to open with haunting visuals, it's refreshing to see the ritual subvert expectations. Even though this supernatural flick revolves around mythical giants and trickster gods, the movie starts to feel like a straightforward drama. But this decision isn't a detriment at all. Instead of potentially alienating the audience with a long-winded explanation about Norse mythology, the ritual begins by focusing on relatable characters who are caught in a grounded scenario. Also, the squelching noise that Rob's cheek makes as the skin flaps open is guaranteed to curdle your blood. It. As corny as the 1990 miniseries of It is, it lives in a warm place in many people's hearts, mainly due to Tim Curry's scene-stealing performance as Pennywise the Dancing Clown. No matter how cheesy you find this version of Stephen King's story, it's always frightening to watch the opening scene of Pennywise slaughtering Georgie. But the It remake of 2017 quickly proved it would be devoid of camp and instead focus on brutal scares. Although the scene in the original film cut away before we saw Pennywise kill Georgie, the gore is on full display here. After Pennywise lures the boy closer, the alien clown sprouts multiple rows of jagged teeth which he uses to rip Georgie's arm off. As Georgie tries to crawl away, Pennywise grabs him and drags him into the sewer. Even though Bill Skarsgård's performance as Pennywise is what people remember about this moment, everything in this scene is phenomenal, including the eerie score, the mesmerising cinematography, and Jackson Robert Scott's disturbingly believable performance as Georgie. Above all, this scene demonstrated how merciless Pennywise is when it came to murdering his victims. On top of that, it proved the film had no qualms with showing kids being killed, which is usually a big no-no even in the goriest of horror movies. A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place takes place in a world where most of human civilization has been destroyed by aliens with hypersensitive hearing. Knowing the slightest sound could get them killed, our lead characters, the Abbott family, get through each day by living in silence. Although A Quiet Place has a brilliant premise, it's hard to convey it in a movie which, has nobody talking. However, the first scene perfectly demonstrates what kind of life these people are living. More importantly, it demonstrates what happens to anyone who doesn't take precautions. After the Abbott family finds supplies in a store, the boy Bo tries to take a toy shuttle from a shelf. His father Lee stops him, knowing the toy makes noise. Bo's sister Reagan feels bad for him and so, secretly, gives Bo the shuttle. As the family make their way home, Bo turns on the toy, causing it to blare incessantly. Lee sprints towards his son as quickly as he can, while his wife stares in horror, knowing Bo's imminent fate. Just as Lee is about to reach his son, an extraterrestrial bursts from the forest and slaughters him. The scene is, in a word, perfect. After a couple of minutes, we know how this world works, understand the family's dynamic, and above all, are made aware of what happens to those who fail to keep quiet. The Ring. Let's be honest, most remakes are terrible, especially when they're horror. Even though The Ring was hyped beyond measure, a lot of people were worried it would tone down the scares of the original for Western audiences. But the beginning of The Ring proves it knows how to set up a chilling premise. Instead of showing us the footage contained in the video or anyone being killed, the intro focuses on two teenagers, Katie and Becca, discussing the cursed tape like it's a ghost story. When Katie admits she's watched the video, we realise things are about to go south fast. Even though an inferior film would show Katie suffer an over-the-top death with unconvincing CGI, the scene would keep everything grounded with simple imagery. Katie sees her fridge door open by itself, then she spots a puddle of icy water on the floor. She then notices the knob of her bedroom door is dripping. After she opens it, she sees the cursed video playing on her TV before the scene cuts to black. Even though this scene is a whopping 7 minutes long and has no blatant scary visuals, it keeps you gripped from beginning to end, simply by using subtle camera work and a focus on atmosphere. Scream. Despite the fact that Wes Craven is synonymous with the horror genre, he struggled to make a hit after A Nightmare on Elm Street. After New Nightmare and Vampire in Brooklyn were shredded by critics, no one was expecting much when Craven announced he was directing a slasher called Scream. Thankfully, the first few minutes of Scream proved Craven was back in his element. The film opens with high schooler Casey talking on the phone with a mysterious caller. When she discovers the caller is a serial killer waiting outside, she realises she's in serious danger. Because Casey is portrayed by Hollywood star Drew Barrymore, viewers assumed she was the lead character, meaning she would survive the ordeal. After all, you're not going to kill off an A-list actor in the first scene, are you? But that's exactly what Scream did. Although the posters and trailers gave the impression Casey was the final girl, the opening scene ends with her disemboweled corpse hanging from a tree. Not only was this scene brilliantly shot, perfectly paced, and deeply unnerving, the casting choice was a masterstroke. After we saw a big name like Drew Barrymore get killed off 10 minutes in, viewers realised no character was safe from getting the chop, which kept us on our toes throughout the whole movie. Jaws. 1 second. That's how long it takes Jaws to get your attention. After hearing just a sliver of that John Williams ominous score while the camera pans across the sea floor from the shark's viewpoint, you can't help being transfixed. As mesmerising as the opening credits sequence is, it's the following scene that's responsible for making an entire generation afraid of going into the water. While teenager Chrissy is enjoying her swim in the sea without a care in the world, the camera keeps strategically cutting underneath her. Every time we cut to the shark's POV, the camera edges closer to Chrissy's dangling legs, highlighting the predator is drawing near. As Chrissy is suddenly jerked downward, the contentment on her face dissolves and is replaced with immediate terror. As she tries to swim to safety, her body is pulled in the opposite direction, proving she's now in the maw of the shark. After another bit of helplessly thrashing, the unseen beast drags Chrissy's flailing body downward, sending her to a watery grave. You know what's the most impressive part? This scene left viewers petrified of sharks, even though we never see one. By using tactical camera work, a magnificent score, as well as a pulley to cause the actress to flail around, this scene freaked us out and made us desperate to see what happens next.
The Hitcher. Even though the evil drifter trope is nothing new, few stories have utilised the idea more effectively than 1986's The Hitcher. Robert Harmon's thriller introduces deranged hitchhiker John Ryder within the first minute. After being picked up by young driver Jim Halsey, John immediately makes Jim feel uncomfortable with his opaque answers and flippant attitude. When Jim asks what John wants, he laughs manically before saying those chilling words, "That's what the other guy said." With that single sentence, the audience realises John is slaughtering anyone foolish enough to let him in their vehicle, and worse still, Jim is intended to be his latest victim. As uncomfortable as this moment is, it only gets worse, since every word uttered by Ryder makes him sound more unhinged. When he starts talking about popping eyeballs and lopping off limbs, viewers feel just as unsettled as the protagonist. The setup couldn't be simpler, but the charming performance makes the scene riveting from beginning to end. Rather than hamming it up, the Blade Runner actor says every line with casual delight, which is far more unnerving. The Invisible Man. The scares come long before anyone turns invisible in this H.G. Wells adaptation. The Invisible Man opens with Cecilia leaving her abusive husband, Adrian, in the middle of the night. After being picked up by her sister, the pair drive off just as Adrian is about to catch them. Thanks to Elizabeth Moss's body language and superb acting, it's clear her character is scared out of her mind. Although jump scares get a bad rap, they're utilised well here. Every time there's a loud noise, viewers know Cecilia's life could be in serious danger. The scene is marvellous at visual storytelling since it's easy to understand what's happening despite the minimal dialogue. When Cecilia shakes Adrian's glass of water, it fizzes up, indicating she's drugged it. A shot of a passport and map can be observed in Cecilia's bag, verifying she's leaving for good. The way she swiftly preps her belongings and alters Adrian's security cameras proves that she's been planning her escape for a long time. A dialogue-free sequence can drag, especially when it's 7 minutes long, but this intro never loses its momentum for a second. Zombieland. Zombieland could have easily come across as a rip-off of Shaun of the Dead, which released 5 years prior, but the feature successfully carved its own identity, putting a distinctive spin on the genre. The movie starts with Columbus narrating how most of humanity has been turned into brain-munching zombies. He explains how he survived the apocalypse by sticking with a set of strict rules, while showing what happens to the poor souls who don't abide by them. The scene doles out exposition in a hysterically entertaining way, while still emphasising how threatening the zombies are. Even though Zombieland is a comedy, it's obvious from the beginning that these mindless revenants will rip your face off. Once Columbus finishes his spiel, the opening credits roll alongside a delightful montage of people being hunted and eaten by the undead. Not only is this sequence hilarious, the clips are shown in slow-mo, giving viewers ample time to admire each frame. It may be a zom-com, but this intro proved the filmmaker took the tale very seriously, and viewers were in for a good time. Don't Look Now. Based on the way Don't Look Now is presented, it doesn't seem like a horror movie. As such, viewers are sure to be blindsided by the first scene. Married couple John and Laura Baxter are keeping busy at home as their daughter Christine plays outside in her red raincoat. While John studies his photographs, the camera makes sudden cuts to Christine, who's hunched dangerously close to a lake. After Laura's wine spills over a picture of a red-coated figure, John notices it looks like the person is bleeding. Believing the image is a sign Christine is in danger, John runs outside and jumps into the water to rescue her. Although John's intuition is spot on, he's too late since Christine has already drowned. In shock, John lets out a defeated wail while clutching his child's body. Even though it's a powerful scene in its own right, this is magnified exponentially through simple film techniques. Rather than relying on creepy music, jump scares, or exposition, the scene uses visual storytelling to convey what's happening, and more importantly, where it's leading. On a rewatch, the scene is more profound, since John's line how not everything is what it seems perfectly foreshadows the gut-wrenching ending of Don't Look Now. Dawn of the Dead, 2004. Zack Snyder must have had balls of steel when he decided his directorial debut would be a Dawn of the Dead remake. Considering George A. Romero's classic is hailed as one of the best and most influential zombie films ever, it seemed to be an impossible act to follow. To the surprise of everyone, Snyder's version was a blast. In fact, the most cynical viewers were sold before the first scene even ended. Less than 5 minutes in, child zombies are chomping on neighbours, helicopters are crashing, and buildings are going kaboom. Even though Snyder's later work tends to be overly stylized, this opening feels gritty and visceral. Rather than relying on excess CGI, the Man of Steel director uses complex dolly shots to emulate our heroine being chased, especially while she's driving. The scene is also memorable because most viewers weren't expecting the undead to run. Save for 28 Days Later, zombies have been commonly depicted as shuffling corpses, especially in Romero's work. Now that the reanimated flesh-eaters could keep up with their lunch, they posed a far greater threat. Even though Dawn of the Dead has many awesome scenes, nothing grabs you the same way as this ferocious sequence. It Follows. In the beginning of It Follows, a half-dressed woman bursts out of her house, constantly looking back as if someone is chasing her. Her shoes don't match her clothes, suggesting she shoved them on in a panic the instant she realized something was following her. She then circles back to her house, grabs her purse, and zooms off in her car. The scene cuts to nighttime, with Annie huddled on the beach in palpable terror. When her dad rings her phone, she answers it, telling him she loves him in a way that suggests that she has accepted her fate. During this conversation, a repetitive thud can be heard in the distance, which sounds eerily like footsteps. The scene suddenly cuts to the next morning, revealing a close-up of Annie's corpse. The camera pulls back, showing her body has been viciously mutilated. With that 3-minute sequence, the audience is instantly invested and petrified beyond measure. Even though the pursuer and the murder itself is never witnessed, viewers immediately understand Annie's concerns were 100% warranted. It's also a great scene since it proves a movie doesn't need to start with a mask-wearing psychopath or a hulking monster to leave a haunting impression. Halloween. Not only did Halloween popularize the slasher genre, it still remains one of the most spine-tingling horror movies of all time. After nearly half a century, the soundtrack, the POV shots, and Michael Myers' featureless mask still remain iconic. And of course, fans aren't going to forget those ruthless kills anytime soon. But in many ways, the most impactful moment in the saga is how it all started. The original Halloween kicks off with an unseen figure stalking a house. Through an unbroken 4-minute shot, we see the assailant break in, grab a kitchen knife, and put on a mask before hacking a teenage girl to death. As the murderer marches outside, their mask is pulled off, revealing the figure to be a 6-year-old boy. And that's how audiences in 1978 were introduced to the legendary Michael Myers. Even though the franchise has had many brutal deaths and shocking twists, nothing had quite the same oomph as this defining moment. But it's not just the reveal that's powerful. Based on Michael's vacant expression, it looks like he doesn't even understand why he committed an act of unspeakable evil. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Although Dracula's origins are etched in mystery in the source material, Francis Ford Coppola gave the blood-sucking Nosferatu a detailed backstory for his film adaptation. Bram Stoker's Dracula opens with our titular character as a mortal man readying for war. When his wife falsely believes her beloved fell in battle, she takes her own life, condemning her soul to hell. Feeling betrayed by the very church he vowed to defend, Dracula renounces God, transforming into a vampire. This prologue is a wonder to behold for 2 main reasons. Rather than concocting some long-winded backstory, Dracula's origins and motivation are concisely summarized in a couple of minutes. Secondly, every visual is a feast for the eyes. The sword being driven into the cross, the statues and candles weeping blood, the silhouette of Dracula hoisting an enemy in the air with his spear. Also, all these glorious images were achieved with zero special effects. In fact, they were devised by Coppola's son. As the final cherry on top, the whole scene is accompanied by Anthony Hopkins' enthralling narration and a magnificent score. After witnessing an opening this visually stunning, horror purists knew they were about to watch something very special. The Voices. One unappreciated flick that fell between the cracks in 2014 is The Voices, starring Ryan Reynolds. In this horror comedy, the Deadpool star plays Jerry, a schizophrenic factory worker who's infatuated with his co-worker Fiona. Due to his condition, Jerry spends his time having imaginary conversations with his dog and cat, also voiced by Reynolds. Watching Jerry being governed by his lively mutt and temperamental kitty highlights early on that he's not in control of his life or his mind, and it's obvious he's on the cusp of a mental breakdown since the presence of Fiona is amplifying his neuroses. Based on the wacky setup, it's apparent The Voices won't play out like a conventional horror. Having said that, the psychological satire is far stranger, funnier, and grosser than anyone could imagine. It plays up the funny side of Jerry's predicament, but never downplays his illness, which makes the story all the more tragic. As a result, people will find themselves laughing one moment and gasping in terror the next. Even though The Voice's first 10 minutes make it clear this is going to be a unique experience, nobody could be truly prepared for what they're about to see. Lights Out. Based on the terrific short film of the same name, Lights Out centers around a sinister spirit called Diana that kills its victims in the dark. Although Diana's elaborate backstory is divulged later on, the very first minute effortlessly illustrates how her powers work. As textile worker Esther prepares to leave the building, she turns off the light, causing a barely visible figure to appear in the doorway in front of her. Unsure if her eyes are playing tricks on her, Esther flicks the light on and off over and over, with the shadowy creature only appearing when shrouded in darkness. When she turns the light off for the 5th time, the demonic entity appears right in front of her, giving Esther the scare of her life. The jump scare doesn't feel forced since it teaches us that Diana only exists in darkness, and also highlights that Diana can only move and attack while in the absence of light. What's more impressive is how this pivotal plot point is conveyed without a single word of dialogue. Thanksgiving. It's a shame Eli Roth followed Thanksgiving with the atrocious Borderlands, since the festive slasher is probably the best film in his repertoire. Not only that, it's evident Thanksgiving was going to be solid within the first few minutes. The holiday horror begins on Black Friday with an aggressive mob waiting for a superstore to open. Running out of patience, the crowd stampede through the security gate and barge into the store. Due to their desperation, the group push through jagged glass and stomp on workers, leading to horrific injuries and deaths. Despite the sliced throats and trampled bodies, the feral customers are undeterred. Though there's plenty of cringe-inducing violence, the most harrowing moment is when an innocent woman has her skull crushed by a trolley. Her hair gets caught in the wheels, causing her scalp to peel off, all while she's still alive. The scene could have come across as schlocky due to the theatrical performances and larger-than-life gore. However, the sequence feels disturbingly realistic as it accurately portrays how a mob mentality can turn regular folk into murderers. The scene hits hard since it focuses less on bloodshed and more on the loss of control people experience when faced with escalating chaos. Although serial killers and monsters are frightening, it's more unsettling to see ordinary people slaughtering one another over a waffle iron. The Stepfather. The Stepfather begins with a disheveled man, Jerry, in his bathroom washing blood off his hands and face. The context isn't revealed at first, but it's implied by Jerry's nonchalant demeanor that this guy is bad news. After washing himself and cutting his hair, Jerry admires himself in the mirror, looking like a new man. As the camera pans around the upstairs hallway, pictures of Jerry and his loving family can be seen as endearing music swells in the background. While Jerry makes his way downstairs, a tilted painting can be observed in the background. Although this seems like a minor detail, a bloody handprint becomes visible underneath as the camera zooms out, indicating there's been a physical conflict recently. As this is going on, a subtle beeping can be faintly heard. And when that alarming beep becomes louder, it's clear the sound is from a telephone that's been left off the hook, again suggesting there was some sort of struggle. By the time Jerry reaches the bottom of the staircase, the camera has panned back completely, revealing trashed furniture, blood-soaked walls, and the butchered remains of the family. Jerry remains unfazed as he strolls by the carnage, affirming he was the one who carried out these heinous crimes. Despite the fact the murders themselves aren't shown, nor is Jerry depicted as anything but calm and collected up until this moment, this one shot told us everything we needed to know about this deranged sicko, the Changeling. The Changeling contains many spooky elements involving seances, astral projections, and a recurring apparition of a drowned boy. Though nothing supernatural occurs in the prologue, it's the most hair-raising moment in The Changeling by far. As music composer John Russell is driving through the mountains with his wife and daughter, his car gets stuck in the ice. While using a phone booth to call for help, John casually monitors his family playing in the snow as he looks into the distance and spots a car coming his way. Due to the slippery ice and the vehicle's speed, John becomes noticeably agitated. Cautiously turning around, he then sees a truck coming from the other direction, in the direct path of the other car. With no warning, the door of the booth jams, leaving John unable to escape. Despite his best effort to pry the door open, John watches the vehicle slide on the ice, causing the truck to fatally collide into his wife and child. Even though the collision itself is horrific, the most haunting moment is the look on John's face when he recognizes what's going to happen and realizes he can't do anything to stop it. Although The Changeling is a magnificent film through and through, it's this moment that makes the largest impact: when evil lurks. Even though When Evil Lurks has a dense storyline and complex lore, very little is directly explained. Instead, this Argentinian gem dumps viewers into the deep end straight away, expecting them to figure it out themselves. In the beginning, brothers Jamie and Pedro discover a disemboweled corpse in the woods, which leads them to a nearby shack. As creepy as this situation is, it's nothing compared to what happens next. After arriving in the household, the owner informs the siblings that her son, Uriel, is possessed. Upon entering Uriel's bedroom, Jamie and Pedro realize they're not in the presence of an ordinary demon. Now the dark entity has seized control of Uriel's body, the poor man has taken on a form that is, for lack of a better word, gross. His body is covered in so many bleeding boils, infected sores, and cancerous growths, he barely looks human. As disgusting as this is to look at, it's worse when Jamie and Pedro move Uriel's rotting body out of the shack, since it causes blood, slime, and pus to seep through his sheets. Hard as it is to believe, this isn't the most disturbing image in the film. In fact, it barely cracks the top 10. With this in mind, When Evil Lurks is a rare breed, kicking off with pure nightmare fuel, yet saving the most traumatizing visuals for later. Late Night with the Devil. Late Night with the Devil is framed like a documentary that explores an infamous episode of a variety show called Night Owls with Jack Delroy. In this particular episode, the host speaks to a supposedly possessed teen, hoping the spectacle will boost his flagging ratings. The Ghostwatch-inspired thriller starts with a 4-minute summary that condenses Jack Delroy's career up until the airing of this infamous episode. Normally, starting a movie with a drawn-out exposition dump should spell disaster. However, the prologue is flawless, as it helps truncate everything we need to know about the enigmatic host's background, ambitions, fears, relationship with his deceased wife, and cryptic references to a secret group he belongs to. The opening also highlights Jack's ratings battle with talk show rival Johnny Carson, which compelled Jack to perform goofier and more lewd acts on the show, compounding his insecurities. Even though many of these snippets only last a second or two, you can tell the cast and production team went all out to bring every one of them to life. Many of these set pieces are so elaborate, Night Owls with Jack Delroy looks like a legit talk show. By the time the sequence ends, there should be a great sense of who Jack Delroy is and what he's trying to accomplish. As a result, the audience is 100% invested in the character before the real story even begins. 28 weeks later. 28 Days Later is directly responsible for revitalizing the zombie genre and popularizing the concept of fast zombies, which is ironic since this post-apocalyptic horror doesn't contain any undead creatures. After making 10 times its budget, it was no surprise that a sequel was greenlit. And based on 28 Weeks Later's opening, it was apparent this follow-up would be as petrifying as its predecessor. In that beginning, we're introduced to Don and Alice, a couple hiding from the infected in a remote cottage with other survivors. When a boy makes his way into the cottage, a horde of infected break in, eviscerating the patrons. Although Don tries to escape, Alice doubles back to save the boy, allowing an infected to corner her. She looks towards her husband, assuming he'll swing in to save the day. Instead, Don slams the door on her and leaves. Leaping out the window, Don sprints across a field and escapes on a boat, seconds before being swamped by mindless savages. Don's behavior initially seems callous, but it's obvious he's not a bad man. After all, he was the person who let the boy into the cottage in the first place. However, this fact makes the scene more heartbreaking as it shows humanity must make cold-hearted decisions to survive in this world. Though the sequence is marvelous from start to finish, it's the shock in Alice's face that tugs on the heartstrings. Watching all the hope drain from her body after her husband abandons her is 1,000 times more spine-tingling than anything the infected do. When a Stranger Calls. The first scene of Fred Walton's When a Stranger Calls is so effective, it should be studied by horror purists. Walton's 1979 picture begins with babysitter Jill Johnson relaxing in a client's living room after putting their children to bed. Jill suddenly receives a call from an unknown person asking, "Have you checked the children?" before abruptly hanging up. Even if it was a practical joke, this simple question is enough to freak out anyone. However, it's soon revealed this is anything but a prank. The anonymous caller rings again and again, becoming more threatening each time. Believing she's in real danger, Jill calls the police, who tell her to stay on the line so they can trace the call. Soon after, the police inform Jill the calls are coming from inside the house. Panicked, she scrambles through the hallway and opens the front door, where she's confronted by a mysterious man. Though this stranger is revealed to be a cop seconds later, it's a heart-stopping moment since the tension is at its peak. Scream may have had a similar opening, but When a Stranger Calls setup is more impressive as it didn't rely on violence or gore to be nerve-wracking. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. People should be on the edge of their seats before a frame of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is revealed, thanks to the bone-chilling text crawl. The narration detailing the aftermath of Leatherface's killing spree sounds so convincing, it's easy to forget this 1974 picture is a work of fiction. As the text concludes, the sound of a shovel scraping off dirt can be heard. Although this shot is in darkness, flashing camera lights momentarily light up the screen, revealing close-ups of bones and decayed flesh. These jump cuts are so quick, it's initially unclear what's being shown, which makes the scene more unnerving. After hearing scratching, cutting, and slicing for a full minute, the camera cuts to a heavily decomposed corpse, its face rotten to the bone. The camera pans back, showing there are 2 cadavers wired up to a cemetery monument, displayed like a twisted piece of art. A radio report can be heard in the background discussing grave robbers in the area, giving critical context to how this abominable exhibition came to be. Despite the fact that the text scroll warned viewers of the horrors they were about to witness, nobody was ready for this level of grotesquerie. Though there's no shortage of disturbing imagery in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's challenging to think of anything as skin-crawling as this opening.